What's up, nerds? Yedok Trenieb here, the internet's shittiest music nerd, and it is time for a review of one of my personal favorite albums of all time, and that is The Mantle by Agalloch. If you live in Canada, then you probably know that we are pretty much in the thick of winter, and I can't think of any better soundtrack for that than this absolute masterpiece. So, for those of you wondering, what the hell am I talking about? Allow me to introduce this record and this band as best as I can. I'm not going to go into anything too in-depth in terms of this band's history, for there are, I'm sure, other YouTubers that are able to do that much better than me, but Agalloch, at the very least, to my knowledge, played a pretty pivotal role in helping to shape and influence sort of the modern landscape of post-metal and atmospheric black metal. Taking some of the atmospheric instrumentation and experimentation already done by, other bands prior to them, such as Ulver as well as arguably Opeth, and bringing it to new genre-bending heights by bringing in influences from goth rock and post-rock and progressive rock, as well as on occasion stuff like, say, folk and singer-songwriter adjacent music. And The Mantle is, as well as their other most famous album, Ashes Against the Grain, are sort of primarily considered to be like the pinnacle of that kind of sound that they've established. And while I do think Ashes Against the Grain is also a great record that I think you should definitely check out if you're into this kind of stuff, of course, I am going to be talking instead about The Mantle, for it is not only my favorite Agalloch record, but also up there as one of my favorite metal records, and possibly albums in general, ever. Now, part of the reason why I'm reviewing this around now, specifically, is not just because we're in the midst of winter, but for whatever reason, this album reminds me of a very specific memory from my life that has stuck with me throughout since it happened. Just over 10 years ago, I was on a school trip to Quebec City in the middle of the winter time. And basically this school trip was my first time that I've spent away from family for very long periods of time. And it was also just not that well planned of a trip, and also often very cold and very physically demanding, since we had to basically trudge through very thick and slushy snow. But also, simultaneously, this is a memory that I look back on with a very strange amount of fondness, for despite how kind of overwhelming this trip definitely felt on occasion, it was also incredibly fun and genuinely beautiful at certain points. And I have tons of great memories of going to the Carnival as well as the Ice Castle. And even though I've never even known about what the hell black metal even was at that time, when I first listened to this record a few years later, for some reason the vibe that it gave me very specifically took me back to that previous memory that I've just discussed, and since then I've been genuinely unable to separate those two things, despite them really not being connected in really any tangible way whatsoever. But strangely enough, that in and of itself is what I think actively contributes quite a lot to my personal feelings towards this record. It to me just feels like an incredible soundtrack to what generally the winter time kind of means to me, just sort of in general. And so whenever I put this record on when going for, a walk in the middle of like a snowy forest, it's always able to create such an incredible sense of magic. But furthermore, not only do I love this record just solely out of, nostalgia, it's also just such a brilliantly made and constructed piece of music that not only, beautifully communicates itself as a concept album with reoccurring themes and, different tracks that seamlessly flow into each other, but is also, like, as previously mentioned, genre bending in a way that's almost hard to detect at first, but then when you actually try to pinpoint what exact genre this album is, you can't help but just kind of look at it from afar and go like, wait, what the hell is this album supposed to be? And I mean this in the best way possible. All of this is communicated with the very somber acoustic opening titled In Celebration for the Death of Man, which seamlessly transitions into the nearly 15-minute epic and one of Agalloch's greatest songs, titled In the Shadow of Our Pale Companion, which is a multi-phased, really lengthy epic, filled with all sorts of peaks and valleys and different switch-ups, all the while remaining thoughtfully paced and thoughtfully written and incredibly cinematic and emotional throughout its entire runtime. And while that song is definitely one of my favorites, and probably, you know, the song that I guess I would say is probably the greatest highlight on the whole album, the quality doesn't ever feel like it dips from there, ever. The following track, Odal, is this really lovely kind of instrumental post-rock number, very akin to the likes of Explosions in the Sky or Mogwai, with these very bright, shimmering guitars and ethereal soundscapes, along with this, you know, really cinematic swell and crescendo. This is something that, if you listen to this album, you will quickly notice is kind of a common pattern throughout this record. We have, like, you know, a song that features vocals, followed by this interesting instrumental that sort of, more often than not, deviates from the metal tag that this record is put under. And this is, you know, showcased yet again with the following two tracks, titled I Am the Wooden Doors and The Lodge, respectively. I Am the Wooden Doors is one of the more intense and more brutal tracks on the record, with these, you know, faster drumming and more aggressive riffs, but it still remains deeply emotional and beautiful, especially around the midpoint, where we get these very grandiose vocal harmonies, along with this almost kind of like flamenco adjacent like acoustic guitar solo. Please feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm referring to it incorrectly, but regardless of what it is still really beautiful. Then The Lodge is this, you know, almost entirely acoustic number with these little bits of electric guitars, but more so just to kind of create like a sense of atmospheric space. And there's also I don't know what that percussive sound is, but there's this really interesting like percussive noise that kind of drives some of the instrumentation that almost kind of sounds like two pieces of wood hitting each other or something like that. I don't know what exactly it is. Then we get to what is arguably one of the most brutal tracks on the record, which is You Were But a Ghost in My Arms, which is, if I remember correctly, probably the only track on the album that features like full-on blast beats at certain points, really making it the most, you know, strongly black metal adjacent song on the whole record. But it is also quite lengthy, and it never really gets dull or stale, and maintains its interest throughout its entire runtime thanks to really great dynamics and switch-ups. But then we have another one of the biggest highlights in the record for me, which is the Hawthorne Passage, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, which is this 11-minute piece that is essentially almost like two songs in one, but it somehow manages to flow really well despite that. The first half of this instrumental piece comprises of these almost kind of like prog and psychedelic rock inspired passages, and there's even a point that features a guitar solo that reminds me quite heavily of like David Gilmour from Pink Floyd. And after some field recordings kind of connecting both parts of this piece, the second half of this track is this really kind of rousing build and crescendo that makes for a really effective, just climactic high point for the record. And the whole track ends with this sort of like passage from the Mexican film Fando y Lis. Forgive me if I'm butchering the pronunciation of that. And what's basically happening in this movie passage is, at first, this character named Lise, who is sort of reminiscing about how she will, like, no one will remember her when she dies, before another character who goes by the name of Fando seemingly goes up to her and comforts her, saying, "Yes, I will remember you." And it is this really, like, sweet and touching moment in the middle of this metal album that kind of catches me off guard, but still really works beautifully for just the overall very, you know, emotional nature of the whole record. Then for the final two tracks, we have And the Great Cold Death of the Earth, and the name of this song is sort of a continuation on the opening intro track titled In Celebration for the Death of Man, as previously mentioned. And it is honestly like such a beautiful way of kind of bringing the record full circle with these very dramatic folky metal passages with these really deeply sad vocal melodies and acoustic guitar solos before finally leading up to basically the theme present at the very beginning of the record with some additional like bells to make this reprise feel, you know, I guess more special and not overly copy-paste, which I think works really well to its advantage. And then finally we have the closer, titled A Desolation Song, which is this sort of like 5-minute, kind of like singer-songwriter number where the lead singer John Home is basically muttering into a microphone on top of this very like glistening, you know, folksy instrumentation. And the delivery of these vocals at the very end of the record always kind of communicated to me as if like the supposed protagonist in whatever kind of story this is supposed to be is just kind of exhausted after what I imagine is kind of like this long journey through a forest. Before, at the very end, we have that woodblock noise present on the song The Lodge that I've mentioned previously, which I think really ends things on a really deeply satisfying note. And so, yeah, that's more or less kind of summarizes generally my experience with the Mantle whenever I listen to it. And honestly, in my opinion, I would consider this, quite frankly, to be a perfect record. If there's any, like, minor nitpick I kind of have with it, it's that, like, John Holmes' general style with, like, the harsh vocals is definitely not super muscular or super aggressive, for sure. He more or less kind of sounds like, more often than not, like he's aggressively whispering into the microphone. And what's really weird, and I cannot for the life of me explain this, like, this kind of bothers me a lot more on later albums, such as Ashes Against the Grain, but somehow, to me, it works very well with the overall atmosphere on here, and do not fucking ask me why that is. I cannot for the life of me explain it. But also to me, like, at the same time, this kind of contributes to, I would personally argue, like, the album's accessibility. Because even though this album often is tagged, you know, as black metal, or other kinds of forms of extreme music and metal music, this record I would also highly recommend for people who are fans of, you know, post-rock and or progressive rock. And while this album definitely doesn't fall into every single, you know, prog rock or prog metal trope super neatly, which to me is part of why I admire it so much, it does feature a lot of aspects of the appeal of the genre with these multi-phased pieces and very intriguing genre bending. And, you know, to go back to my point about, you know, the vocals, the fact that they're not excessively that aggressive, I think can help to kind of lower the barrier for some people when it comes to the aggression of harsh vocals in extreme metal music to begin with. And this record just never fails to provide just such a special and powerful experience to me whenever I listen to it. If somehow you haven't heard this record yet, especially if you're into music of this ilk, I would highly, highly fucking recommend you check it out as soon as you can. And so that is my review of Agalloch's The Mantle. I'm really hoping I was able to communicate my feelings on this album effectively. And if you've heard this record, what do you think of it? Do you like it? Do you not like it? And that is it for today. Thank you guys so much for your time, and I will hopefully see you next time. See ya!